Anyways, great, welcome. Good to be here this afternoon, late morning. David Swing, representing the California Police Chiefs and co-chair of the Stop Data Analysis Subcommittee group. And it's my privilege to do a quick round of introductions. I know we have four of our subcommittee members on the call, and so I'll turn it over to my co-chair, Dr. Raphael, for a quick introduction, and then to our other two members after that.
Thank you, Chief Swing. Steve Raphael from UC Berkeley. I'm the representative of the governor's office and co-chair of this subcommittee as well. Andrea Guerrero.
Good morning, everyone. Andrea Guerrero. I'm the executive director at Alliance San Diego and appointee of Senate President Pro Tem Tony Atkins. And shall I pass it to somebody else?
I think to Brendan Woods.
Yeah, I think I'm the only one left. Good morning, Brendan Woods, Public Defender of Alameda County. I represent the California Public Defender Association. So, good morning.
Morning. All right, the next up on our agenda is the approval of the July 30th subcommittee meeting minutes. Hopefully everyone on the call has had a chance to review those minutes, and if so, entertain a motion for approval.
I make a motion for approval.
Second.
Okay. There's a motion, a second, to approve the minutes. Any discussion or questions about the minutes? Any opposed? You want to oppose to the approval of the minutes? Hearing no approval, that motion passes. And we'll move on to our updates from the Department of Justice. I'll turn it over to DOJ at this point for an update.
Hi, everyone. This is Kevin, a research associate here at California Department of Justice Research Center. I'm going to provide an update here. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you all. I'm going to run through some of the updates to both the Stop Data Analysis section, as well as provide some updates on the content that the department has been assisting for as far as data analysis goes for incorporation in some of the policies sections of this year's report. The policy subcommittee just met yesterday afternoon to discuss some of these same sections that we'll be discussing today. But those sections all contain analyses that were not previously in drafts that were discussed at the July Stop Data Analysis Subcommittee meeting. And so much of the update that I'm providing here today will center around those analyses, but I will start here with a run through of some of the quick updates to the existing Stop Data Analysis section. So I'm going to stop sharing my video because my computer doesn't like when I stream the video and share my screen at the same time, and I will share my screen so that I can share a presentation with you all. Let me turn off my video here, and then let me share this screen. Hopefully, oh man, is this showing up? Can you all see this little blue jeans thing there? Let me move this over onto this screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint here. So again, a quick overview here. I'm going to run through some updates to the Stop Data Analysis section of the report, as well as run through some of the main analyses that are included in the policy sections. As you can see, the meeting materials provided for this meeting that constitute both the Stop Data Analysis section as well as the policy sections. There's quite a bit of content there. I won't be able to touch on all of it specifically, but I'm more trying to provide a general overview of some of the analyses included in these sections to give people who haven't had an opportunity to read through the entire sections yet an opportunity to kind of get a feel for the sections as they sit right now, and specifically about the data analysis included in those sections. So to start with, I'm going to talk about some of the updates to the Stop Data Analysis section of the report. The meeting materials have the section from page 1 through 39. One of the first things that we changed in response to some feedback from the last subcommittee meeting was that we added some agency stop distributions that look at stops by agency in both 2019 and 2020, so that readers can kind of see the reduction in the number of stops reported in 2020 as compared to 2019. Overall, that reduction was about 27%. So that was some feedback that we received last time, just to give readers a feel for how the data differed in 2020, a year in which there was a pandemic occurring between that year and the year prior. So that was added as well. There are also some changes to the American Community Survey section. That was a lot of the discussion during the last subcommittee meeting. So in response to some of the feedback during that meeting, we added some expanded methods context in front of the results for that section. There's more information still in the dedicated methods appendix, but we added some more in front to kind of contextualize that, give readers a better understanding of that approach up front. We also updated some of the figure titles to try and make those a bit more straightforward for people to understand at a glance what they're looking at. Added in some additional text box callouts, et cetera, and footnotes, kind of denoting some of the considerations between the 5-year file that we're now using for the American Community Survey and the 1-year file. And then we also added a secondary American Community Survey comparison in text that was previously only in the appendix. And this one kind of displays, and there was a desire expressed at the last subcommittee meeting to have an unweighted California residential population comparison. And one displays the unweighted California residential population distribution compared with the CHP's data, which serves the entire state as a kind of more straightforward, easy to grasp California distribution there. In addition to those updates to the American Community Survey section, the department also reran some of the analyses for the gender and LGBT sections while excluding data from the California Highway Patrol. The department ended up having to do this due to an error that we discovered as we were going through and working on the a section that I'm going to talk about here for the policy section here in a moment. But we discovered actually 2 errors in the California Highway Patrol data. One affected records for individuals whom officers stopped from the California Highway Patrol that they perceived to be gender nonconforming. There was essentially an error in the code that CHP sends to the Department of Justice that was causing there to be errors introduced for these records. And so the department worked with CHP in late summer to address this issue and have CHP resubmit these records, and the department was able to update them in the stop data collection system to correct these errors. And so we were able to do the analyses after we corrected those, at which point Research Center discovered another error in the data transmitted from the CHP that affected records submitted for transgender individuals. Again, upon conversations with the CHP, it was determined that a software program that they refer to as the RIPA Object Builder, which from my understanding, and I'm not an IT person, but from my understanding, converts the data collected from CHP for RIPA from the file format that CHP stores it in, or database, and converts it to the JSON file that they transmit to the department. That program introduced an error into the data only for records of persons whom officers perceived to be LGBT. Given the timing of when we discovered this error, the department is not going to be able to update those records within the system, have the analyses rerun and ready for publication by the statutorily mandated January 1 release date for the RIPA Board's report. And so in order to avoid issues of only having records for cisgender and gender nonconforming individuals in CHP's data in analyses that primarily focus on transgender disparities, we took the approach of excluding CHP's data from these analyses in this year's report. There was some discussion about this at yesterday's policy subcommittee meeting. I know that Dr. Kajavi brought up some concerns here, and so hopefully when she comes back in, she may want to continue some of those conversations here with this subcommittee. But I have a section here at the end of this presentation that kind of summarizes some of the input from the policy subcommittee from yesterday. And lastly, for updates to the stop data section, there were some updates to appendix tables for clarity, and these were in response to comments received during the last RIPA Board stop data subcommittee meeting. And so now I'll run through some of the new content that was not discussed at previous meetings. First are some data analyses included in the section entitled From Data to Policies Addressing the Profiling of Transgender People. In the meeting materials, this section is page 40 through 67. And here we continue some analyses that started in the intersectional section of last year's report, examining outcomes for transgender individuals and contrasting that with cisgender individuals. And so I'll run through some of the analyses here. There are more included in the report. We just don't have time for me to sit here and present everything. But we start by looking at reason for stop, and here we see that whereas most stops of cisgender individuals in the data are for traffic violations, that's not the case for transgender individuals. The most commonly selected reason for stop for transgender individuals is actually reasonable suspicion in the 2020 data. Board members may recall that the American Civil Liberties Union sent a letter to the board earlier in this year encouraging the board to examine the data for sex work related offenses, and they've expressed some concerns regarding enforcement of these sex work related offenses. They had specific penal code sections that were included in that letter that were of particular interest to them. Those are in footnote 20 in the meeting materials on page 47. And so within the reasonable suspicion, we took a look at what proportion of reasonable suspicion stops across genders were for these sex work related offenses. And we find here that transgender individuals were stopped, their reasonable suspicion stops about 3%. Officers noted that the reason for stop was that they suspected the person of engaging in sex work related crime, whereas cisgender individuals, those rates were about 5% to 1.5%. So transgender individuals had a larger proportion of reasonable suspicion stops that were for these sex work related offenses in 2020. We also looked at use of force rates across gender categories. Here we see that transgender individuals have higher use of force rates than cisgender individuals in the data. We also took a look at the result of stops. So officers are required to indicate whether they made an arrest, issued citations, took some other reportable action outlined in the regulations. And here we took a look at when they took no action as the result of stop, and we see that that occurs more frequently for stops where the stop was of a transgender individual rather than a cisgender individual. Lastly, in this section, we re-examine search and discovery rates as we did in the previous year's reports. And again, we find that transgender individuals have much higher search rates than cisgender individuals, while discovery rates are fairly consistent across groups. So there are other analyses there, and there's some policy recommendations and discussions, as well as discussions of other research outside of the RIPA data in the policy sections, but I'm just running through some of the primary analyses that are included in these sections here. So the next section is the data-driven approaches to disability justice section, which is on page 68 through 93 of today's meetings materials. And kind of picking up where we left off in the last section, again, we re-examine search and discovery rates similarly to how we did in the 2021 report. And again, here we see that persons perceived to have mental health conditions or other disabilities have much higher search rates than individuals perceived to have no disability, while also having lower search discovery rates. Use of force rates are also much higher for persons perceived to have a mental health condition or other disability relative to the use of force rates for individuals perceived to have no disability. When we look at the reasons for stop, there are very large differences for the reasons for stops across these groups. A majority of individuals who are perceived to have no disability were stopped during traffic violations, whereas over 50% of individuals perceived to have other disabilities were stopped for reasonable suspicion, and over 85% of individuals stopped who were perceived to have a mental health condition were stopped for reasonable suspicion. And there are some quirks within the data as it's currently collected under the current version of the regulations that hopefully the next round of regulations fixes will serve to address, that we'll kind of explore here when we're looking at stops specifically for reasonable suspicion for persons perceived to have disabilities especially. So here we look at the reasonable suspicion subtypes broken down by disability group. So these are all stops that were for reasonable suspicion. And here we see that persons perceived to have no disability, officers tended to stop them or select most frequently that they observed these people committing a crime, whereas the most frequently selected category under reasonable suspicion subtype for persons perceived to have a mental health condition is not that they observe this person committing a crime, but rather they select other. There's no text box for them to fill in afterwards, so it's just other in the regulations. And one of the reasons why officers are doing this here is because within the current version of the regulations, in the primary reason for the stop, there's no field for them to select if the stop is during a community caretaking interaction. And so officers are trained to select reasonable suspicion, select other for the subtype, and then there's a specific CJIS code that they put for the offense code type that indicates that this was a community caretaking stop. And so that's why we see, part of the reason why we see such a high reasonable suspicion stop rate for individuals perceived to have mental health conditions or other disabilities is because within the current way that the data are collected, officers are kind of shoehorned into making those selections to indicate that these interactions occurred during community caretaking interactions. And we'll see that here on this next slide. We see
This is David Swing. Just a quick, would you like questions along the way or at the end?
I don't have a preference. Whatever works best for the board members.
Can we go back to that previous slide?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. When looking at searches and stops for mental health condition, does our data articulate or determine if a hold or the person was placed on a mental health hold in the data set, and then also does it determine if the reasonable suspicion stop was a call for service or officer initiated?
Yeah. So those fields exist within the data. So calls for service is separate from reason for stop, but there is a field where you can break down stops by calls for service and basically what we refer to as officer initiated stops. So those exist within the data. It is possible to break the data down that way. And as far as hold, let me look here in the regulations. There is a result of stop field. I want to get the exact terminology correct here.
I know that we can't. I know we're kind of late in the process, so I'm not looking to change what we have. I'm just wondering if the search has coincided with being placed on a mental health hold or detention, as opposed to a consent search, and then also if the original stop was generated on a call for service as opposed to a officer-initiated activity.
So, okay, yeah, I see your question here. So we can, yeah, it's certainly possible within the data to look at what proportion of like these reasonable suspicion stops here are initiated in response to a calls for service versus officer-initiated stops. As far as there is a result of stop field of psychiatric hold, in parentheses, pursuant to Welfare and Institution Code Section 5150 or 5585.2 field as well, that some of these data can be broken down, like what proportion of these stops results in that result of stop. Is that what you're getting at here? Maybe you'd be interested in seeing?
Exactly, because a search incident to a 5150 or 5585 is akin to a search incident to arrest with respect to someone being transported and searching for safety-related reasons. So I'm glad to hear that our data can be broken down to that granular of a level. That's helpful.
Okay, and you mentioned search. So what I'm presenting here is just about stops. There was going to be a little bit of discussion about searches here in a second here, but specifically these aren't filtered. What you're seeing here are just stops for reasonable suspicion. They aren't specific to searches. So it's certainly possible to like break these down by what proportion were calls for service, what proportion ended in a result of stop of psychiatric hold.
All right, thank you. Brendan, you have a question?
I just had a quick question going to earlier, and this might get too technical, and tell me if it is. You mentioned earlier quirks within the data around reasonable suspicion with people with perceived disabilities. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so that's so it's not specific. I guess I should be clear. It's not specific to persons perceived to have a disability and the quirk within the data. The quirk within the way the data are collected currently is that under reason for stop, there is no specific field for officers to select when, or under primary reason for stop, there's no specific field for officers to select for that variable to basically indicate that this was a community caretaking interaction that resulted in a stop. Under the current version of the regulations. This is something that agencies have constantly brought up since the regulations were finalized, and it is something that is currently in a regulations change proposal to introduce a different method for accounting for these interactions so that we're not capturing them under reasonable suspicion stops, because they really aren't reasonable suspicion stops the initial reason for the interaction was not that they suspected a person of committing a crime, which is generally reasonable suspicion stops that invokes in people's heads. And so this is really a workaround that the department has developed for agencies to be able to note interactions that occurred during community caretaking contexts, but it's not the most ideal approach to collecting these data. And so that is why there is currently in the regulations packet that the RIPA board meant to discuss. I believe it was back in September, and that there's going to be updates to currently that are going through. There's going to be hopefully a change to the reason for stop field that will allow for officers to collect this in a more straightforward way. We also hope that that will enhance data reliability as far as the way that officers collect this information, because currently denoting that a stop occurred during a community caretaking contact is kind of nestled within 3 fields, and so it's possible that some officers may not know how to properly denote that under the current guidelines. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Kevin, do you know offhand if I'm just looking across the picture that's up on the screen now, the much higher proportion that's matched suspect description suggests to me that the stop likely is a call for service, or perhaps more likely to be calls for service, and which I imagine just kind of raises just important policy questions about having alternatives for people to call if somebody is visibly distressed, or for whatever reason somebody might be calling on someone who's having a mental health crisis. And I think it may, if not for this draft, maybe for next year, but exploring the interaction between these categories and when it's officer initiated versus call for service, I think would be interesting. And it just looking at the first 2 bars in the first 2 graphs, where you have a big drop in officer witness and then a sizable increase in matching descriptions.
Absolutely. And I believe that I can't speak to as much of the policy recommendations as, say, some of the attorneys from the Civil Rights Enforcement section can, but I believe that there are discussions in the policy section that these analyses go in that discuss exploring alternatives for responding to calls for service for persons experiencing mental health crises as well. And so these certainly, when we can go back in the data and make sure that this certainly does, matching suspect description does, those bars being higher certainly points to a higher proportion of these stops being initiated in response to a call for service. But we can go back and confirm that within the data. And this certainly would support that policy recommendation. So if it's all right, I will continue on through some of the additional slides. So we were talking about a much higher proportion of stops of individuals perceived to have a mental health condition or disability occurring during community caretaking interactions. Here you can see the scale, less than half a percentage point of individuals who were stopped, who were perceived to have no disability, were stopped during community caretaking interactions, whereas over a quarter of individuals perceived to have a mental health condition were stopped during community caretaking interactions. Within the draft, there are also a series of other analyses where we break down community caretaking stops and look at outcomes by disability type, while contrasting community caretaking stops with non-community caretaking stops. And some of the interesting things that we see there within the data are that for persons not perceived to have a disability, their search rates and use of force rates are higher during interactions that were initiated during a community caretaking function than non-community caretaking functions. However, when we look at stops for community caretaking purposes of mental health, persons perceived to have mental health conditions, their search rates and use of force rates are actually lower than search rates and use of force rates against individuals perceived to have a mental health condition who are stopped for non-community caretaking purposes. So it's kind of the inverse between persons not perceived to have a disability and persons perceived to have a mental health condition. I'll note, though, and it's very apparent if you look at these charts within the draft, that regardless of whether or not the stop was initiated during a community caretaking or non-community caretaking purpose, use of force and search rates are much higher for persons perceived to have a mental health condition than persons with no disabilities. There's also a continuation of the consent searches section from last year's report and this year's report, and there are some analyses.
Before you go on, can I ask, make a quick suggestion on this section that you just covered?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think, some of the terms that we're using in this report aren't necessarily commonly understood, and it would be great to make sure we have a definition of what community caretaking is, or what that involves. And then in the section above regarding gender data, there's we use the term qualified offense, and I don't think people know what those are. So if we could define them, I think that would help the public understand this information.
I don't know if this was the case for everyone else, but some of the audio there was a bit choppy for me. So can I just repeat the request to make sure that I got it correctly? You'd like to see a definition of kind of what community caretaking stops constitutes within the draft when we're talking about these issues, and you'd also like to see in the I think the transgender disparity section, you'd like to see more explanation of quality of life, about what those quality of life offenses that are included in the policy discussions there.
Yes, yeah. So I just put it in the chat too. Yeah,
okay.
Just defining terms so that the public understands what we're talking about.
Okay, sorry, I'm taking a note there about these specific items of interest. Okay, thank you. Appreciate the feedback. And so there's a continuation of some of the consent search work that was done in the 2021 report. This is on pages 94 through 117 of today's meeting materials. Some of this will look very familiar to people who are familiar with the 2021 report. We see that generally, overall, officers ask about 3% of individuals that they stop for consent to either search their person or their property. This varies by race and ethnicity, with multiracial and Black individuals having the highest rates of being asked for consent to perform a search. Overall, of the people who are asked to consent to a search, about 95% of these individuals do consent to the search, meaning that refusal rates for consent searches are about 5% overall. This varies between, I think, 4-point-some-odd% up to 9% by race and ethnicity. We look at 3 different categories in this section of searches. Consent-only searches, which are basically searches where officers provide the only basis for performing the search as the person consented to a search. Consent-plus searches, which are searches where consent was one of multiple bases provided as the basis for conducting a search, and then other discretionary searches, which are basically all other searches except for searches pursuant to a warrant for vehicle inventory purposes, as well as incident to arrest. And what we see here is that across the different search categories examined here, Black, multiracial, and Hispanic individuals tend to have much higher search rates than other groups and relative to white individuals. And when we look at discovery rates for these different search types, we see a general trend that, with the exception of a few race and ethnicity categories as well as search types, most search discovery rates tend to be lower for individuals of color than for white individuals. Particularly for this section, it's the case that some of the top 5 largest differences here in lower search rates are for consent-only searches. So those for Black individuals, Hispanic individuals, and multiracial individuals tend to be far lower than those of consent-only searches for of white individuals. We also look at the kind of stops where these searches occurred. And we see that overall, most consent-only searches occurred during stops for traffic violations. However, this varies by race and ethnicity. And we see here that in the chart here that Black individuals actually had about 2/3 of their consent-only searches occur during interactions that began as a stop for a traffic violation. This is more than 2 times the proportion that this occurred for white individuals. We also looked at the result of stop resulting in no action, and what we see here is that stops with consent-only searches ended in no action taken towards the individual who was stopped, most often for Black individuals in comparison to other race and ethnicity groups, followed by Native American individuals. We also are following up with some additional analyses from the 2021 report with regards to supervision searches. So this is on pages 118 through 133 of this year's, or I guess this meeting materials. Similar to what we did for consent and consent-only searches, we took the same approach for supervision searches. And again, here we see that Black and multiracial individuals tend to have higher supervision-only search rates, supervision plus search rates, as well as other discretionary search rates relative to white individuals and some of the other race ethnicity categories captured within the data. A noteworthy finding here, specific to supervision-only searches. So again, supervision-only is basically searches where the only basis for conducting the search that officers provided was that the person was on supervision with a search condition. They didn't provide any other bases for conducting the search. And here we see that across all racial and ethnic groups of color, search discovery rates for searches that were for supervision only were lower than white individuals, with the largest differences being for Black and Hispanic individuals who were stopped and subjected to these types of searches. We also looked at the stop context in which these searches occurred, and here we can see that whereas the majority, or maybe not a majority, but the most frequent stop type for other discretionary searches to occur was during reasonable suspicion stops. What we see here is that for supervision-only searches, the most common stop type would be for a traffic violation, which are the most common stop type in the data. And then we also see, of course, here that a higher proportion of supervision-only searches and supervision plus searches occur during stops that were initiated because officers knew that the individual stopped was on supervision. We do see that these proportions vary by race and ethnicity here, with Black individuals.
Can I interrupt for a quick question? I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. My brain's not working properly, I think. I'm just curious if you can give some examples of other discretionary searches. I'm just trying to think of some.
Other discretionary searches?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in the regulations, there's a field where officers indicate the basis for the search, for conducting a search. So if they indicate that they conduct a search in the data, they have to provide a basis or bases for conducting the searches. The selectable options for this field are consent given. So if they just selected that would be an example of a consent-only search. There are also options for officer safety / safety of others, condition of supervision, suspected weapons, visible contraband, odor of contraband, canine detection, and evidence of crime, as well as exigent circumstances or emergency. So those would all be other examples of bases that are captured under this umbrella term of other discretionary searches.
And I'm sorry, I was thinking consent searches were excluded because we did the section earlier, but I got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Let's see here. Oh, yes, I was saying that the reason for stop varied by group, by racial and ethnic groups for supervision-only searches, where we see that Black individuals had nearly 60% of these searches occur during stops that were initiated for traffic violations, and they also had the lowest proportion of supervision-only search stops occur during stops that were actually initiated because officers knew the person to be on supervision at the point when they stopped the person, or that was the reason for the stop, which is an interesting finding there. And again, we see here when we look at the proportion of stops that have a supervision-only search by race and ethnicity group, Black individuals tended to have no action taken as a result of these stops most frequently out of all the groups, followed by Native American individuals. And lastly, this year's report includes a policy section that deals with traffic and pretext stops. It's the shortest section of the meeting materials of all the sections that we're going over here today on pages 135 through the end of the meeting materials. And this is more so an introduction and a kind of a stage setting section of the report to kind of set the stage for the board to continue this work in more detail moving forward in this next year and potentially other years' reports in the future. And so there are a series of analyses here, but I've already gone over on time here, so I don't want to get too in depth into these, but these are kind of introductory. There's more that we can do here. The policy subcommittee yesterday was discussing some ideas that they have for things that they'd like to explore in the future. But some of the things that we started of setting the stage with were kind of some breakdowns that show of traffic violations. There are moving and equipment violations denoted within the data, and then also, non-moving and equipment violations denoted in the data, and contrasting that with what percentage of stops were for moving violations. The majority were moving violations, with roughly a quarter being for non-moving violations. And oftentimes people view moving violations as stops for moving violations as stopping speeding or running red lights, making unsafe, safely, recklessly. So being in the good of the public safety for other motorists and pedestrians, whereas there are studies that look at moving violations and non-moving violations and equipment violations is more susceptible to being pretextual stops. And so there's some discussion within the policy section surrounding that. And so we also did look at the proportion of traffic violation stops that fell in the moving or non-moving categories, and we see that Black individuals had the highest proportion of any race ethnicity group that had their stops for non-moving violations, although for all race and ethnicity groups, moving violations are the most commonly cited reason for initiating traffic stops. There are also in the report some examinations of specific offense codes that are of interest in this section, which the policy subcommittee yesterday was talking about, wanting to drill deeper in future years' reports around specific offense types. And so we're interested in hearing what board members have to say about what they might be interested in exploring as it relates to traffic and potential pretextual stops in future years' reports. So as I've mentioned the policy subcommittee a few times because they met yesterday and discussed these sections, I just want to run through a few different things that they wanted to see. They didn't have they had a lot of feedback for the department. I've outlined a few things here that are specific to some of the discussions surrounding the data. The policy subcommittee wanted to see some clarifications surrounding the explanation for the CHP data errors to make it more to make the language more precise, to specify that the error was introduced through a technology issue and not from an officer data entry issue. So we'll be making that revision. They also were curious about how bicycle stops were identified within the data, because there is a regulations proposed change to actually create a field where officers would select basically the context, and they would indicate separately that this was a stop of a bicyclist, but currently under the data collection, that's not the case. And so they wanted more information to be included about how these bicycle stops were identified within the data, which is something that we can easily add. And then there are also some questions surrounding some quirks within that allowed for specific offense types, like cell phone violations, to show up under both moving and non-moving violation types. And so we're also going to include some additional clarifications surrounding kind of the way that the data are collected and outlined in the regulations that allows for that, and what we think it might mean as far as officers entering the data. And again, the policy subcommittee did have, I don't know if joined yet. I'm not looking at the the video.
Can
Oh,
I
no,
just
yep, I see.
unmute?
Yeah.
I'm just so everyone knows. Sorry, this is Board Member Lily Kajabi. I was able to join in around the data around stops under supervision, and it's great to see everyone. Thank you.
I'm really glad to have you. And so there was also some discussion surrounding the CHP data error issue that resulted, or where we had to result to excluding their data from some of the analyses specific to gender and LGBT. And in this year's report, and a desire to find a way to kind of add some additional analyses potentially in the future, but keeping in mind that we do have to meet that statutorily mandated January 1st release date for this year's report. And so there were some preliminary discussions about what that might look like that Lily may wish to talk some more about and get some ideas and give some feedback from the board's perspective about what that might look like in your eyes. But lastly, I just want to go over one more thing. There was a request at the last full board meeting for some this is content that's not yet in the draft, which is why this might look new. But Rachel just finished running some of these analyses at the end of last week after the drafts were distributed. But we're also planning on including some content that would look at calls for service versus officer-initiated stops, and looking at those those stops and the racial and ethnic distribution of individuals who are stopped under those contexts as compared to the ACS distributions, because this was something that was brought up during a discussion surrounding the ACS distributions at the full board meeting. There was a desire to also take into account calls for service and contrast that with officer-initiated stops. So we're in the process of developing a little bit of content that would include a discussion of these analyses here that you see that show officer-initiated stops in one distribution. Again, those represent about 94% of stops this year. And then calls for service broken out by itself, and only those stops considered in contrast with ACS distribution of the areas that made calls for service or stops. And so we see here that overall the officer-initiated American Community Survey comparison distribution looks very similar to the overall one that's been included in all the drafts that everyone's reviewed this year. That's because it's 94% of the data. However, we do also see that the calls for service distributions look roughly similar. There are some changes here when we look at just calls for service, right? We see that Black individuals constitute a higher proportion of individuals stopped under calls for service than they do in officer-initiated stops, and that the opposite is true of Hispanic individuals. But we also see that still the largest differences between the proportion of individuals who are stopped that are Black and the residential population of those areas that made the stops for calls for service is also the largest disparity here for calls for service. And that the largest disparity in the opposite direction, showing underrepresentation in the stop data, is still multiracial individuals here. So there are some differences there that we'll be discussing in the next draft that goes out to the full board. But these are kind of what those distributions look like, so that the stop data subcommittee can get an advanced look at some of this additional content. This will likely end up in the calls for service section of the report. So there will be some additional RIPA data analysis in support of yet another subcommittee's work this year. So with that, I've talked a little bit more during this time period than was initially carved out for me, but I appreciate everyone listening and posing questions, and I'll be here to answer questions as needed during the board members' discussion of the report content. So thank you.
Evan, thank you for that presentation. Very informative, and we had some questions along the way, so no problem going over time, because I'm sure that was taken up by board member questions and conversation. So again, thank you for your presentation and the work of the team on this analysis. Open the floor to my colleagues and for discussion.
I have a couple of, I guess, not technical questions, but clarifying questions for Kevin. Kevin, on that final slide that you were showing us, is the reason why the residential distribution change, are we to interpret that as when we weight the tabs by the number of calls for service, that there's more of that in cities with larger African American populations, and that also they're more likely to pertain to members of the public who are stopped who are Black? That was the first question. And then regarding the protectual stops, or the stops that are for non-equipment violations, it seems like a very sensible, and I know you guys have probably already thought about this, but a sensible tab would be to see what the outcomes of those stops are in terms of citation versus, a warning, or just letting things go from there. And I'd be curious to see what those look like. And then just a third in the same vein, when we were talking about the mental health searches and stops. So there's the issue of the 5150 holds, and it frankly would also be interesting to see how often it is the case that people are searched, and what the outcomes are in terms of arrest, citation, warning, or I guess a 5150 hold would be one of the possible outcomes as well.
Yeah, so working my way back there, it sounds like there's some desire to, in the section that talks about differences across disability type, looking at an expanded results of stop rate. So looking at more than just, I believe that currently there's in there some discussion and a graphic on no action rate as the result of stop in that section. I may be incorrect on that. I don't have the meeting materials sitting right in front of me. I have the PowerPoint pulled up. But to expand that to include both other types of result of stop, arrest, citation, 5150 hold. And then the other question, the second question, citation rates for in the pretext stops. Yeah, that's absolutely something that crossed our minds as we were going through, looking at basically non-moving and moving violations, and looking at citation rates and whether those vary by race and ethnicity groups in the context in which they're stopped. So that's definitely something that we're planning on working into the analyses that we'll be performing for the, I guess, what is it, the 2023 report that the board will be working on next year. That's certainly on our plate for that work. And then I believe the first question was about the last slide that I showed there with the American Community Survey distributions for calls for service and officer-initiated stops. And what you said is exactly the case. Differences in the American Community Survey populations that are displayed there in the gray bars do vary between officer-initiated stops and calls for service stops, because they're weighted based on stop frequency of the agencies that made officer-initiated and calls for service stops, and that will vary quite a bit with, of course, the California Highway Patrol making a very large proportion of the officer-initiated stops, whereas California Highway Patrol has less of an effect on the call for service stops, and so those stops will, and the weighted distribution there, will represent the area served by the sheriff's departments and municipal agencies more. Yeah, that is exactly the reason why that looks that way.
Thank you. Other questions or discussion? The committee?
I'd just like to offer a comment that I found the analysis in the policy sections to be quite thorough, and it's just such an advance over previous years' reports, where we're going beyond describing to trying to dig into important topics, and I just commend you guys. You've done a good job.
Yeah, I echo that. I think every year we're getting more sophisticated, and that's due to your hard work, DOJ. So really appreciate all that work. I think because of the length of this report, it will be voluminous. Formatting is going to be important, and making sure that the way it's formatted is easily readable, headers identifiable. If there are call outs, that those are clear, all of that. So to your design team, please pay attention to all that so it's accessible to the public.
I actually want to make a comment there because there was a comment that I believe Lily that you made at the last full board meeting, and it was that you had some concerns surrounding the color schemes used in some of the graphics, and so that's something that is still on our radar. It's not reflected in this draft, but there is a team at the department that after the report is voted on, finalized, this gets routed through that team, and they handle kind of some of the formatting issues towards the end in December, and we're hoping that they can assist us with finding color palettes that are printer friendly as well as color friendly for people who may be colorblind. And so that is something we haven't. I know that the draft doesn't look different in the color schemes that are used there. We've been focusing on making other revisions, but that is something that's still on our plate moving forward. And yeah, Andrea, you're absolutely right. The formatting team has their work cut out for them with the length of this year's report, but I believe that they're up to the task, especially given that hopefully the board will be voting on this on the very first day of December, which is earlier in the month than in years past. And so we're hoping that will translate into the formatting team having more time to beautify the report. So yes, that's something that we're considering as well, yes.
Hi, this is board member. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Wood.
No, Luana, go ahead.
After you, Luanda.
Okay, this is board member LaWanda. Kevin, the report is awesome. I haven't had a chance to go through it all, but I just want to know, did they ever break down the highway patrol? Because the highway patrol, CHP doesn't, it patrols the whole state, but it may patrol certain areas a little bit different. And if we're not breaking it down, we don't really know if there's difference, what's really going on, because we're taking it as a whole. And what may be going on in Southern California may not be going on in Northern or Central California. So
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so most of the analyses included in the body of the report don't focus on region or even on specific agencies. It mostly looks at the data as a whole, so not broken down by region of the state that the stops occurred in or the agency that's making these stops. There are some exceptions where we filtered out CHP. But in cases where in the future where we want to run analyses that break up analyses by, say, region of the state or by agency, it may make sense for us to then break out specific regions that CHP patrols. I know, for example, I have not gotten through the entire report, but I did watch a presentation for the Public Policy Institute of California recently, and they analyzed some RIPA data. And in their analysis, they actually did break down CHP's data by region. And so it is possible to do, but the analyses included in this year's report don't really break down the data by region for any of the analyses. And most of the analyses that are in the body of the report don't focus on any one specific agency. And so for that reason, we don't have the data broken down by region that California Highway Patrol patrols. But it's certainly something that, assuming that in future years the board wants to explore some more region-specific analyses or agency-specific analyses and make the focus down narrower, that's something that we could do. Absolutely, that would be worthwhile to do.
Thank you, Kevin. I just questioned because the Highway Patrol CHP is huge.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's a little bit different than law enforcement agencies. Like we had like the first wave of law enforcement agencies, second wave of law enforcement agencies. So they were hitting certain areas. So yeah, so maybe the Highway Patrol needs to be looked at. Yeah.
This is Brendan. I want to echo the comments of my colleagues, and the data is very, very good. I guess every time I look at it, though, I get pretty depressed with regard to the disparate treatment, especially of transgender and African Americans, Black people. I do want to say that some of the stories and quotes that are included here from the Atlantic, and it's the treatment and what transgender people go through is absolutely gut-wrenching. but I think it's the report that I've reviewed so far is very, very good. It's excellent. So just and I keep backing into thinking, how are we addressing these issues systemically? So that's kind of where I go back to, and the policy recommendations. So thank you.
Credit to the Civil Rights Enforcement section for finding all of those quotes and including them and incorporating them in the draft for that effect. So I'm glad that board members are appreciative of those inclusions, but credit goes to the Civil Rights Enforcement section for incorporating those.
I'd like to echo the comments too that my board members have shared. This is a really strong report. It's very broad, but it also goes deep into many areas. And this is going to be, I hope, a great foundation for us as we look at next steps, further recommendations, actions that can be taken. And so I'm looking forward to later in this meeting even starting to flesh those out, starting with Lawanda's suggestion about CHP and so on. But I just want to thank all the folks at DOJ who've contributed this. Really, there's a lot here.
Board Member Guerrero, did you have additional comments? I wasn't sure if you had a chance to weigh in. All right. Well, I'll echo a lot of what was already been said. As I mentioned earlier, I think the report has a lot of great content and detail, and Dr. Kajabi, like you had said, it's broad, but it goes into some really nuanced areas. It gets to some good detail, and look forward to the continued conversations related to the report and the data that's here, and how we work to continue our work. That sounds redundant, but at any rate, at this point, we'll open up the public comment. And we'll do as we have in the past. We'll start with different geographic regions of the state. I'm going to open up my participant list. And if you are able to raise your hand on virtually on the participant list, please do so. And we'll start with Southern California. So any public comment from Southern California?
I see Mr. Hilton in the queue.
Oh, yeah, I don't seem to be able to raise my hand.
Welcome.
Thank you. I find myself being increasingly confused, and I'm particularly confused when we have a category being reported upon that does not exist, is undefined. What are these multiracial people that I heard so much about? They're not in the data dictionary. How can anyone analyze data if this group is not defined? If you look at the data dictionary, and I put it in the chat, there's no such group. Second question. If only 1,000 people were impacted, persons, by the glitches, corruption, or data conversion issues, how is it possible that I received over 16,000 corrective records that would apply to them? The arithmetic doesn't work. At least no arithmetic that I know. So I would love to have clarification on that. An editorial. Earlier this year, our AG reacted to a report that said blacks were the subject, or the object rather, of the greatest number and increase in hate crimes in this state. He reacted to it by forming a task force and hired attorneys to combat hate crimes against Asians. And now again, we have the condition of disproportionate abuse of the field interview process, where in Los Angeles, Black people are subjected to that 10 times as often as others. And yet, the CADOJ finds it possible not to mention that. At least if they did mention it, I can't find it. Sitting under that is the matter of 1 million field interviews that have gone unreported. How is that possible? It seems to me that this board that is meant to do away with bias may be practicing that. Now, I'm not going to be all negative. I wish to commend everyone involved for having embraced sensible data integrity standards. Now, most people don't know about that, but that is what is happening. What is being done is that the CADOJ and the CJIS group are now looking at data from other sources to make sure that the data is good. What I find interesting about it is that this is what I recommended to them 5 years ago. But the difference now is that the recommendation did not come in black skin. So embrace away, CADOJ. I wish to embrace you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Additional public comment from Southern California? Okay, hearing now, we'll move to Central California. Any public comment from Central California? And hearing and seeing none, we'll move to Northern California. Any participants on the call that would like to have public comment from Northern California? Okay, seeing and hearing none, we'll move to next steps. And I know there's some questions and some ideas from my colleagues about discussion of next steps, so we'll open the floor to the committee.
Well, I think the one open item that I saw and I already commented on is maybe working on a something akin to a pre-analysis plan for the stops that are moving violations versus non-moving violations. I think that's going to be quite interesting, and it seems like many of the tabs and the tests that you've been running, cutting the data in different ways, just provide, going through the full suite of tabulations and results, I think is going to be very productive next step and then perhaps also illuminating about things one could do to sort of reduce disparities in stop rates.
I know that Board Member Hawkins had talked about CHP and trying to conduct a further analysis on CHP by geography, as well as part of that analysis. There was some support throughout the committee for that. Dr. Kajabi, did you have additional?
Oh, thank you. So I just wanted to echo Board Member Hawkins' great point that CHP, because it's such a large agency, looking at it in smaller chunks, I'll just say informally. Also looking ahead, we'll have ever more we're going to have a much larger pool of law enforcement agencies reporting out, but many of them will be much smaller, and so I want to think a little bit about ways to meaningfully see what's happening in smaller agencies without letting the data sort of be outweighed or swamped in the larger pool. I don't have a feel for what the number of stops is going to be from smaller agencies, but once the data comes in, we'll want to think about how to handle that. And then there were just two or three items I wanted to raise that came up in the policy subcommittee meeting yesterday, and Kevin already alluded to them. His last slide, or one of the last slides, sort of bullet points. One is this issue that happened with CHP data. Our understanding is that it affected about 1,000 stops, but these were in particular of individuals who had been perceived as being in the trans community. And so it wasn't that 1,000 sort of random stops from among the group were excluded. It was a specific subset. And so we may want to see if there's something that merits going back and looking at that pool in particular, because my understanding, it's not that the data was lost, it's that it wasn't coded in a way that could be incorporated in this year's analysis. The second is that there was recent LA Times coverage, so on a different note, about bicycle stops, analyzing bicycle stops by the Sheriff's Department. There are pronounced racial and ethnic disparities in the stops and in searches, and as one example of interest to us is that their analysis looked at a specific violation, for example, riding on sidewalks, the way that the legal lay of the land varies from city to city, the availability of bike lanes, and so on. But the point is, by looking at a specific violation code was significant in their analysis, and other board members have raised this in the past, that looking to see which violation codes are most common, and in particular, I'm thinking ahead, are there policy recommendations we want to make? It might be that we want to look at bicycle stops in particular, so that was mentioned at the policy subcommittee meeting, but also this idea of vehicle codes. Board member Raphael has suggested in the past, for example, if registration issues are a large source of stops, are those issues that maybe could be handled in a different way than law enforcement, a different way than traffic stops. So looking ahead to types of violation or digging deeper into that. And then finally, Kevin, I just wanted to highlight something you noted, that the way the data is collected, that is the categorizations, are going to change a little bit when the new regulations come in. So it's going to be easier for us to see what are driver stops, what are pedestrian stops, what are bicycle stops. The analysis we have so far for bike lights that we've included everyone DOJ in the report, those stops were found by looking at the specific vehicle code violation, but we want to get a feel for what's happening to bicyclists in general, let's say, or in particular drivers in general. So I'm looking forward to the changes that are coming in the way data is collected. I think it'll allow us to pose some sharper questions or narrower questions if we want to. So I don't know the best way to keep track of these sort of ideas for next steps, but those were some of the ones that I thought some items that'll merit our looking at next year.
Thank you for bringing those up. I know that those were discussed at the policy committee, and you were present for that and leading some of those conversations. So I appreciate you bumping those into this conversation as well. And I too just want to point out and emphasize that last point that you made there, that although in this year's report there is a section in the pretext section of the report that looks at violations related to bicycle lights, as denoted by a specific vehicle code section. It's in Appendix E, specifically what that vehicle code section is. I don't know it off the top of my head. But that does not capture the full universe of stops of bicyclists. And so assuming that element of the updates to the regulations that are proposed currently go through, we will be better able to analyze stops specifically of bicyclists in future years. I mean, those regulations changes aren't set in the proposal to go into effect until, I believe, someone from Presser, correct me, January 1 of 2023. And so the data collected under those new set of regulations would be required to be transmitted to the department by April 1st, 2024, for the board to include in its analysis for that next year's report. So I am excited, as it seems like some of the board members are, about the prospect of getting updated and improved ways to collect the data, as outlined by the revised regulations that are being currently proposed. But we are still a couple of years out from having data that would be collected under those new requirements. So in the interim, we will still have to find workarounds, as we have been having to for the last few years, for identifying things like bicycle stops, or identifying stops of people who are in vehicles and things of that nature. But I am looking forward to the increase as far as analyses when those regulations go into effect.
And thanks for that correction.
Lily. Oh, no, yeah. And also for your other points, I've been taking notes here. I think that your points about looking at specific code sections and that yielding some good findings that are actionable is absolutely correct. And so, as board members have ideas about what specific code sections the board might be interested in doing analyses that are specific to, you all could just feel free to email that over to the department so that we can begin compiling a list of what those may be. I'll give an example. So in the slideshow that I was going over earlier, there was a section that deals with sex work-related offenses. We were able to identify those within the data because the ACLU sent that letter to you all earlier in the year, where they specified which penal code sections were of concern for them. And so that allowed for us to then say, okay, well, these are the penal code sections we're going to specifically examine within the data for this analysis, which is a big help to us in helping us provide direction for what people want to see as far as the analyses are concerned, and what the concerns are. So as board members have ideas about specific, as you're reading, as you're having conversations with members of your community, feel free at all times to send emails to us about ideas that you have about areas for exploration as far as offense codes go, because we are interested in compiling a list that will help us with some of the pretextual stops as well as other sections next year. But registration, as Steve's mentioned before, bicycle, as well as some of the obscured windows violations that are in this year's report, are all things that are in the forefront of our minds as of this point in time in the report. But as that changes via board member input, please be sure to let us know.
To that point, Kevin, about looking at different code sections, would it be, I think it would be helpful to bring the different code sections to the Stop Data Committee for maybe some perspective about what other sections might be applicable, instead of, in addition to hearing from certain groups, so that there's a kind of a full review of other potentially applicable sections as well, or just to kind of have that fuller analysis. I think the committee here has some good representation of very different disciplines, and can provide probably a wider view of other applicable sections. Absolutely,
I'd like to do that. How that would look in practice, we can probably discuss in coming meetings. An idea that we were having earlier this year would be to kind of look at, break down the specific offense code sections for traffic violations, say, since that's a focus of one of the sections this year, as well as local ones. And breaking down those offense codes cited in that traffic violation type field, and then kind of doing some distribution so that board members can see specifically how often officers selected each of those and how that might vary by identity group. The issue we encountered there is just there are thousands of codes that officers can select in those fields, and so the only real way we can present that to you all is by putting that in like big Excel sheets, and but it's certainly something that's possible that we could bring to. It would just be it would be a different format meeting, kind of more exploring data exploration in real time on a public meeting, if we wanted to have it all with all the board members present at once. But it would be a different kind of format, but it's something that I think could be interesting to explore, especially to get people's input about what offense types they'd like to prioritize for focusing on in next year's report, it could be a very beneficial exercise towards the beginning of it. So if that's something that the subcommittee is interested in, we can absolutely begin working towards that come the beginning of next year.
Hello, hey, this is Board Member Hampton. I called in. I apologize. I'm out of state, and I didn't take into account the time change. I think that's what screwed up my calendar. So I did come in about 40 minutes late, so I apologize for that. One of the things I wanted to ask is, because I didn't see it in any of the data represented, was the high collision impact areas or high vehicle collisions versus PEDs, vehicle versus bikes, things like that, with relation to the traffic stops. I know, again, using my city for an example, we set up motor officers to specific intersections based primarily on the amount of collisions that have occurred in that intersection. And I was just wondering, is that data captured at all on these on any of the data with regards to the drop-down menus and everything like that for the RIPA data?
So is the question, make sure I'm understanding this here, is the question, are the locations of collisions captured within the RIPA data?
Yes, yeah, just the primary reason we post motor officers, for example, at an intersection would be to slow traffic. We've had many collisions in a particular intersection or something like that. And I don't know if that data is captured. I don't think there's a drop-down menu for that, for our motor officers that are doing that. And I don't know if that's something that CHP is doing as well.
Well, in the RIPA data, we don't have specific information about collisions or areas that are prone to collisions, or specific information that's collected for the purpose of denoting that officers are in an area or performing a job duty that is intended to, try and prohibit or reduce the amount of reckless driving that's occurring. I'm looking here in the regulations currently. I think that traffic, unfortunately within the regulations, traffic enforcement is grouped in with patrol and field operations as far as officer assignment types. And so it's difficult to identify officers who may be serving the specific traffic enforcement, like motor officers, that specific purpose to their job duties within the data, because it's the officer assignment type collected at a granular level where we can break out traffic enforcement officers or stops made by traffic enforcement officers from stops made by people who are working patrols or other field assignments, unfortunately, within the data. That is kind of a limitation to the way that the data are collected currently. My memory of, and it's been a while since I've looked at the regulations packet, is that's not something that is currently proposed as a change either. Although Cress, if I'm wrong there, please correct me. Tanya is the lead there running on the regulations updates, so I may be misstating that, but I believe that that's not something that's proposed currently in the regulations change.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, this is Board Member LaWanda, and I know that the report we don't get into detail about communities, but if we don't look at the disparity in code enforcement and break it down, where if we're having it in a certain area more than other areas, then how do we know? For example, you say you got 1,000 people, and then in one area, they may show like blacks being stopped. Just for example, it may show that blacks being stopped. It may be 50 out the 1,000, and so you're thinking that it's not really a problem because it's 50. But if those 50 are being stopped in a certain area constantly, we won't know that. That is a problem, because in that area may only be 75 blacks. So if we're not, how do we get a little bit more detailed, because we're not seeing, because we're not looking at it like that, I don't think. And how do we get that to find out if there's problems in certain areas so we can identify that and we can help law enforcement identify it too? Because they may not be able to see it too, especially if you get a big law enforcement agency and you're only seeing small numbers, but that small number could be representing just a certain community. So how do we come up with that type of information so we're able to identify if there's a disparity in enforcing the codes in certain areas?
This is Board Member Hampton again. I believe that idea was tabled and didn't pass a vote. Originally, I think we had discussed residency and that data. If I recall, that's what ended up happening with that.
I'm not sure if that vote that you're referring to, Board Member Hampton. But what I will say is that this is absolutely a great question, and it's something that I think that the board may wish to consider moving forward. I mean, I don't have an answer to that question currently. I think one of the complex issues that will face the board moving forward is that the board is required under statute to analyze the data statewide. And so because there are so many different sub-geographies within the state and, looking at specific neighborhoods or neighborhood blocks and enforcement patterns there, because we are, the board's charge is to examine the stop data as a whole. Oftentimes analyses may, or at least they have been, focused on taking a wide view of the data rather than being super specific to a very locale. But I do think that this is where the openness and the requirement under statute that the data are open to anyone who requests them and why the department publishes them on the Open Justice web portal and releases them pursuant to Public Records Act requests is because it's important also that the board not be the only source of analysis for the RIPA stop data, because the board's charge is to examine the data statewide. And there may be specific groups in specific locations or cities, neighborhoods that wish to work with the data to address issues within their own communities. Allowing for the data to be accessed by anyone who wants to request it means that, local researchers can request the data for their area and then perform their own analyses. And we see that in some of the things that board members have brought up today with LA, I think it was LA Times, conducting analyses of that are specific to areas within Los Angeles because the data are open. We've also seen that with other groups as well, publishing reports that are local to their area using RIPA data. And so the board is not the only group that is going to be tackling these issues, especially at the city or neighborhood level, that the RIPA data are intended to, through being open to everyone, empower communities to analyze their own data and make their own recommendations for their own municipalities and agencies' consideration. And so I think that part of the answer to this question will be that the board will have to, where appropriate, ways to identify areas where they want to focus specifically on local geographies, but also to highlight when other researchers, community groups, agencies, etc., are doing work with the RIPA data and noting those findings as well as a way of bolstering the reach of those reports that are independent outside of the RIPA board.
Thank you, Kevin, because I don't want it to come off that we're taking a whole law enforcement agency and saying that it may just be in one area. We might be having this issue. And sometimes these reports will come out and make like the whole agency is looking bad. And it's not that. That's why I'm just saying a disparity. Yeah. We just need to know where it's happening exactly at. And I don't want the whole law enforcement agency in certain areas to be looking bad.
I think, that's a great point. And, in situations where we do find disparities or when other researchers find disparities, they're looking at the data at the agency level. It's going to be within the agencies and the community's interests to dive deeper into the data from those agencies to try and identify if there are specific areas or units within their departments and agencies that are the source of these disparities. And so that's certainly going to be within agency interest as more people begin doing analyses at the level.
Any additional comments and discussion for next steps? Okay, hearing none, let me back to the discussion here. We're set to adjourn. Just want to check in with DOJ and make sure that is there any additional information or discussion from DOJ staff?
Just wanted to remind everyone that the next full board meeting will be on December 1st at 10 a.m. And the meeting notice and agenda are posted on the RIPA website, and materials will be posted there ahead of that meeting. So we appreciate the board's participation here and the public's participation, and we look forward to hearing more from all of you at that meeting.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And with that, we can go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you all for being present, and thank you to my colleagues on the board for your input and insight into the discussion. Look forward to seeing you all at our next meeting.